The most harrowing night of the entire year was New Year's Eve. While the whole family was gathered around the dining table for the holiday feast, the man I had loved for my entire youth grabbed a thick leather belt, marched up to me, and roared, demanding that I drop to my knees and repent for the sin of adultery. The whistle of the heavy leather belt cutting through the dry, heated air of the house felt like a blade slicing through all my dignity and sense of justice. I didn't cry, nor did I beg. I simply and quietly pulled out a small USB flash drive from my pocket, the very spark that would ignite the total collapse of this family. It was almost laughable because, in just a few moments, the shameful, disgusting secret of my mother-in-law and my brother-in-law was about to be exposed to the world. The husband of my husband's sister was caught in an unspeakable, compromising situation. How did I end up in such a desperate predicament? I, who had always been the obedient, quiet, and submissive daughter-in-law. And how did I obtain this spine-chilling video? It was New Year's Eve. The fireplace was warm, and the people's temperaments were running even hotter. My husband's massive 2-story colonial home in an exclusive gated community in the affluent suburbs of Chicago was livelier than ever. The rich aroma of slow-roasted prime rib, wafting from the kitchen mixed seamlessly with the smell of the honey-glazed ham my mother-in-law was preparing. Eleanor had just finished arranging the side dishes on the buffet island, and the booming laughter of the uncles and cousins, combined with the footsteps of kids running around the heated garage, painted a picture of domestic harmony that anyone would envy. I, Mia, had been busy in the kitchen for 5 straight hours. While my hands quickly tossed a massive fruit salad, my eyes kept darting toward the living room where my husband, Michael, was chatting with his uncles. His broad shoulders, his crisp button-down shirt, and his gentle smile still made my heart skip a beat, just like the day we first met. I had always told myself that as long as he was here, as long as this family remained peaceful, all my endurance and patience were worth it. Until tonight, for the past 5 years, I had merely been fooling myself. The New Year's Eve party, though seemingly joyous on the outside, was built on a fragile facade. Eleanor, my mother-in-law, a woman with a sharp, domineering personality whose word was considered absolute law in this house, seemed kinder than usual today. She handed me a slice of artisan Gouda cheese and announced to the room, "Our Mia is so sweet and hardworking. Ever since she became my daughter-in-law, you wouldn't believe how much weight has been lifted off my shoulders." I merely kept my head down and offered a polite smile, a smile I had perfected over the years. Learning how to appease others. I knew it was an empty compliment. Just a week ago, she had ruthlessly berated me at Whole Foods because I accidentally bought slightly bruised organic vegetables. She had called me blind and useless, a complete embarrassment to her social circle. My husband's sister, Emily, was a beautiful woman, yet she constantly wore a melancholic expression. Beside her stood her husband, Richard, an outgoing, charismatic man who always knew exactly how to charm my mother-in-law. He was the perfect son-in-law whom Eleanor constantly praised, always comparing him to Michael, whom she deemed too soft and lacking in corporate ambition. Everything would have continued in this fake, harmonious bubble if it weren't for the notification chime from iMessage on my phone. I had left it resting on the kitchen island while washing the dishes. The text was from my boss, Mr. Anthony, an older regional manager who always mentored me at work. It was just a simple New Year's greeting. Mia. Wishing you and your family a happy new year and all the best. It was a completely innocent text, but Michael saw it, and it became the match that lit the fuse of a tragedy that had been brewing for a long time. Michael picked up my phone, and his face instantly hardened. His gentle smile vanished, replaced by a cold, alien expression I had never seen before. Without asking a single question, he walked silently into the grand living room, where everyone was watching Dick Clark's New Year's Rockin' Eve countdown on ABC. Right on cue, as the clock prepared to strike 12 in the sacred midnight hour of the new year, when everyone stood up to raise their champagne flutes for a toast, Michael suddenly spoke. His voice shattered the festive solemnity of the room. "Hold on a second. I need to say something to all of you." Everyone looked at him in total confusion. Michael walked to the center of the living room and held up my phone. "Mia, come here for a second." A dreadful feeling made my heart race. As soon as I approached, before I could even ask what was going on, he hurled the phone onto the glass coffee table. "Explain to me who this bastard is, texting you at this hour. You're cheating on me behind my back." The entire room froze, and I was rendered speechless. His accusation felt like a bucket of ice water dumped over my head in the middle of a warm room. I stuttered, "What are you talking about?" "That's my boss. He just sent a generic Happy New Year text." But my weak explanation was no match for his seething rage. Eleanor immediately stepped forward. Her glare was sharper than a butcher's knife, and her voice cut deep. It was as if she had finally found the perfect excuse to humiliate me. What kind of boss texts another man's wife in the middle of New Year's Eve? "I knew it from the moment I looked at your face that you couldn't be trusted. You're one of those married women who just can't stop flirting with other men," my sister-in-law, Emily, added, her voice dripping with sarcasm. "Mom, don't be surprised. She's pretty. It's normal for men to chase her. I just feel so bad for my brother. Michael." I felt the room spinning. Why? Why were they twisting reality like this? I looked at Michael with pleading eyes. "Honey, you know my character. I'm not like that." But Michael refused to even look at me. He turned his head and stared blankly at the wall. And then, he did something I would never, ever forget. He walked over to the corner of the living room, near the coat rack. Hanging there was his late grandfather's thick leather belt, supposedly kept as a family heirloom to discipline unruly generations. He grabbed it. The sound of the stiff leather cracking in his grip was terrifyingly dry. "Get on your knees right here, in front of me and in front of this family," he growled through his teeth, his eyes bloodshot with fury. "Confess your sins. Tell me how many times you've slept with him." Paralyzed by fear, I took a step back. My entire body was trembling. No, this was not my husband. The man standing in front of me was not Michael. This was not the man who promised to protect me for the rest of my life. This was a monster. I shook my head as tears streamed down my face. "I didn't do anything wrong. Please, don't do this." "Still denying it?" Michael yelled. He swung the belt backward, and the sharp whistle of the air braking pierced my ears. Not a single relative intervened. My mother-in-law just stood there, arms crossed over her chest, wearing a satisfied, wicked smirk. The relatives were either scared, morbidly curious, or simply turning me into the main protagonist of their grotesque theatrical play. Right before the belt could come crashing down in the very second, I thought I was going to die being beaten and humiliated on New Year's Eve. All the love, all the patience, all the fragile hope of the past 5 years shattered into absolute dust. My heart didn't ache anymore. It grew incredibly cold. It turned into a jagged block of ice. I was no longer a sacrificial lamb waiting for the slaughter. No. Tonight, I was going to prove to them that when a sheep is pushed into a corner, it can become a wolf. I didn't step back anymore. I stood up perfectly straight and looked directly into Michael's eyes. My hand slowly slipped into the pocket of my slacks. There, I had hidden something far more terrifying than his leather belt. A small USB flash drive containing a truth capable of burning down all the fake prestige of this family. And as I began walking toward the massive flat-screen television, I knew I was about to be the one to bring them to their knees. And when the first image appeared on the screen, I knew that this New Year's Eve would not just be a night of fireworks, but the night this highly respected family would plummet into utter disgrace. What happened in the minutes that followed? Everyone in the room held their breath with my every step. The belt in Michael's hand stopped midair. He became an ugly statue, a symbol of domestic violence and cruelty. All the eyes that were previously filled with shock, contempt, and sick satisfaction were now locked entirely on me, a small figure swimming against a violent current that threatened to drown me. They probably thought I had lost my mind. A woman, accused by her husband of adultery on New Year's Eve, surrounded by a hostile family. Instead of kneeling, crying, and begging, she was calmly walking toward the television. Eleanor's lips twisted into a sneer. The smile of pure disdain clearly appeared on her perfectly made-up face. "What new trick are you trying to pull now?" Who is this little theater act for? Or are you going to play a slideshow with sad music to gain our sympathy? Her mocking voice shattered the tense silence, echoing off the high ceilings of the room. My brother-in-law, Richard, who always played the role of the model son-in-law, let out a highly exaggerated, patronizing sigh. Mia, if you did something wrong, just admit it. The most important thing for a woman is to protect the honor of her husband's family. If you make a massive scandal out of this, you're only going to hurt yourself. His words, which sounded like sincere advice on the surface, were actually just another blade rubbing salt in my wounds. He was indirectly confirming my guilt, suggesting I should silently endure this humiliation. I didn't answer. My hands didn't even shake when I plugged the USB drive into the side port of the giant smart TV. I had prepared for this moment for a very long time, not out of malice, but through tears and degradation. The remote control was resting on the coffee table. I picked it up and slowly pressed my fingers against the buttons. The glare from the screen illuminated my face. I imagined that in that exact moment, I looked frighteningly calm. I had spent way too long being a worthless actress in a play called The Happy Family. I had learned the role of the reasonable daughter-in-law, the worthy wife, the person who knew her place. I had played that role so perfectly that I had almost forgotten who I actually was. I, too, had feelings, I felt pain, and I possessed dignity. But tonight, that role was over. The director of this new play was me, and all of them one by one were going to be forced to play their true roles, stripped of their masks. I turned my head and scanned the entire room. My eyes locked onto the man I had once loved more than my own life, Michael. He was still standing there, the belt in his hand trembling slightly. The initial fiery rage on his face was now mixed with a hint of shock and deep confusion. He probably couldn't comprehend how I could be so eerily calm. Why wasn't I screaming or pleading like he and his family expected? Mia, what are you doing? Don't make the situation worse. Worse? I smiled faintly. A smile completely devoid of warmth. A smile where desperation had solidified into stone. Do you think there's anything worse than this, honey? Is there anything worse than being humiliated, falsely accused, and almost beaten by your own husband in front of your entire family on New Year's Eve? Tell me, is there anything worse than this? My voice wasn't loud. But every single syllable sliced through the silence of the room like a surgical needle, cutting right through his cowardice. I stared directly into his eyes, desperately trying to find any trace of the old Michael, the man who had vowed to protect me. But all I saw was emptiness and fear. Michael lowered his head. He couldn't answer because he knew I was absolutely right. Seeing her son pushed into a corner, my mother-in-law suddenly shrieked. Her voice grated against my eardrums like a razor blade. What right do you have? You dirtied the honor of this family with your whoring. It's only normal that he beats you. Michael, go ahead, hit her. Son, teach that bitch a lesson. She was egging him on. It seemed she couldn't wait to see me suffer. She thrived on my pain. But it was too late. Her words now merely served to make the play I was about to broadcast even more dramatic. Without uttering another word, I turned around. My fingers slowly pressed the play button, and the television screen lit up brightly. What appeared in crystal clear, full HD quality on their expensive TV was a very familiar setting. The very living room of this exact house. You could see the expensive, polished leather sofa and the large, imported landscape painting my mother-in-law was always bragging about. And there were two main protagonists performing in a play that was 1,000 times more disgusting than the false accusation they had just hurled at me. The woman in the video had her hair tied up and possessed a very familiar physique. It was none other than my mother-in-law, Eleanor. And the man tightly embracing her, endlessly caressing her bare back, was my brother-in-law, Richard, the husband of Michael's sister. This scene, this shameful and deeply secretive act of lust, was broadcast in excruciating clarity. Uncensored, right in front of the entire family. It felt as though everyone in the room suddenly stopped breathing. The loud pops of fireworks outside suddenly felt incredibly trivial and distant. The whole world seemed to shrink down to the deafening silence and the vulgar, repulsive images dancing across the large screen. The leather belt slipped from Michael's grip and hit the hardwood floor. It made a dry, pathetic clack that sounded as though the honor of the entire family was shattering into a million pieces. The whole prestigious family was forced to become witnesses to an unbelievable, stomach-churning truth. But how did I obtain this horrific video? And what was the reaction of each member of my husband's family when their true faces were revealed on New Year's Eve? It felt as though all the oxygen had been violently sucked out of the room. Time stood still. The moment those sickening images played, exposing a vile and twisted reality, no one could look away. The hushed whispers completely ceased. The children's laughter from the other room died down. A heavy, suffocating silence enveloped everyone. The color drained from every person's face, shifting from shock and confusion to absolute, unfiltered disgust. The aunts and uncles who constantly boasted about the family's superior moral values were now sitting with their jaws practically on the floor. Their eyes were glued to the screen. It was as if they couldn't process what they were seeing. Eleanor, my mother-in-law who just minutes prior was arrogantly preaching morality and screaming for her son to beat me, was now frozen in place. Her eyes were locked onto her own writhing image on the television. Her face turned as white as a sheet of printer paper. Not even her meticulously applied, expensive makeup could hide the sheer panic and monumental humiliation that washed over her. Her lips twitched and moved, but not a single sound came out. She swayed, barely managing to grip the armrest of the sofa just to keep from collapsing. My own body was trembling like a leaf in the wind. Beside her was my brother-in-law, Richard, the man who always acted so refined, educated, and kind was in no better shape. His face was ghostly pale, and beads of cold sweat immediately broke out across his forehead. He muttered in a pathetic, shaky voice, This is a deep fake. It's edited." But his desperate words were utterly useless against the stark, undeniable, high-definition reality playing out right in front of their eyes. Anyone with half a brain could see it wasn't edited, it was the truth. A vulgar, incestuous, revolting truth. But perhaps the most shell-shocked of all was my sister-in-law, Emily. She was paralyzed. Her beautiful, yet perpetually sad eyes were now brimming with sheer panic and earth-shattering heartbreak. She stared at the man she had trusted implicitly, the man to whom she had dedicated her youth to build a family. Then, she looked at her mother, a woman she deeply revered. The two most important people in her life had betrayed her in the most agonizing, humiliating way imaginable. Tears cascaded down her cheeks. There were no sobs. Just a heartbreaking, devastating silence. She slowly turned her head to look at me. In her eyes, the sarcasm and disdain were completely gone, replaced by a complex, indescribable gaze. There was anger toward me for exposing this cruel reality so publicly. But there was also a profound, recognizable trace of mourning. As for my husband, Michael, he simply collapsed into the nearest armchair. It looked as though every ounce of strength had been drained from his body. He stared at the screen, then at me. His eyes were swarming with incomprehensible confusion. He probably couldn't fathom that his mother, the woman he practically worshipped, the woman who constantly manipulated him into accusing and treating his own wife like garbage, was the lead actress in the most disgusting drama of infidelity. The faith and immense respect he held for her for decades had completely crumbled into dust in a matter of minutes. Amidst the horrific silence, the only person who managed to maintain their composure was me. I picked up the remote control and quietly pressed the pause button, freezing the screen on the most humiliating, compromising frame of my mother-in-law and brother-in-law. Then, I turned around and looked directly into the eyes of every single person in that room. My voice was not loud, but it rang out clear and hard, like a judge's gavel striking their guilty consciences. What happened? You all look so surprised. My highly respectable mother-in-law. My beloved, perfect brother-in-law. Do you recognize this video? Do you like it? I can play a few more. I have plenty of others, from different angles, recordings spanning an entire week, and I have the unedited original audio files too. My words acted like a second bomb detonating in the living room. Finally, Eleanor reacted. She let out a manic, guttural scream, a hybrid of pure fury and primal terror. "You psycho! You dared to install hidden cameras in my house? Michael, why are you just standing there? Smash that television and kill her. She lunged at me like a wounded, rabid animal, her hands raised with claws bared, ready to tear my face off. But this time, Michael didn't follow her orders. He remained glued to his chair, motionless, his vacant eyes staring into the abyss. My brother-in-law, Richard, scrambled to intervene, not to protect his mother-in-law, but to lunge at the TV to snatch the USB drive out of the port. "Give it to me. Give it to me right now," he shrieked. He desperately wanted to destroy the evidence. But I was faster. I yanked the USB drive out and clenched it tightly in my fist. "You want to take it? It won't be that easy. And don't forget, I saved copies of the originals in multiple secure cloud servers just in case something happens to me. Or, just in case I decide I want the entire town and your country club friends to enjoy this beautiful performance of yours tomorrow morning." My threat worked instantly. Richard froze in his tracks. His face was bloodless. He knew I wasn't bluffing. He knew his lucrative corporate career, his pristine reputation, his family, everything he had painstakingly built was resting squarely in the palm of my hand. Just a few minutes ago, this entire family was sitting on the high throne of moral judgment. And now they had plummeted into the abyss of disgrace. The play was over, but their tragedy was only just beginning. But how did a submissive daughter-in-law like me obtain such a highly incriminating video? It was no accident. It was the culmination of 5 years of pain, abuse, and a creeping suspicion that had been secretly festering in my married life. The biggest question burning in everyone's mind at that moment, the question I could read clearly in their terrified eyes, was, why? Why me? How did the seemingly innocent daughter-in-law, the one who always kept her head bowed and took their abuse in silence, end up holding such a horrific secret in her hands? They probably thought I was a calculating, vindictive mastermind who had spent years digging a trap and plotting my grand revenge, waiting for the perfect day to strike. But they were wrong. I wasn't a hunter. I was just a victim who, after being hunted and cornered for far too long, finally learned how to protect herself. I didn't actively seek out this truth. It was a truth they practically forced me to confront. It all started about a year ago with small, subtle signs. Scattered puzzle pieces that, at first, were so hard to imagine and so morally repugnant that even I refused to connect them. I began to notice something highly unusual about the relationship between my mother-in-law and my brother-in-law, Richard. Initially, I thought it was just the special affection a mother-in-law held for a highly successful, capable son-in-law who always knew how to make her happy. Eleanor was always singing Richard's praises. His charisma, his way of navigating life. Even the specific way he picked out the artisan fruit baskets he gifted her. Whenever Richard came over, she would personally go down to the kitchen to prepare his favorite gourmet dishes. This warm, loving dynamic was a stark contrast to the dark, sour expression she normally reserved for me and Michael. Deep down, it made me slightly uncomfortable, but I told myself it was perfectly normal. My husband, Michael, was a man with a softer personality. He was loyal, but a bit slow and unambitious. He wasn't as sharp, cunning, or charismatic as his brother-in-law. So, it made sense that my mother-in-law adored Richard more. I tried to comfort myself with these rationalizations and push past the vague feelings of unease. But this affection slowly evolved into something much stranger. It began crossing the boundaries of a normal mother-in-law and son-in-law relationship. I started noticing the lingering looks they exchanged. Quick, stolen glances that were heavy with hidden meaning. Brief touches that seemed accidental, but lingered for an uncomfortably long time. One day, I was in the kitchen. I accidentally glanced into the living room through the crack in the door. My mother-in-law was sitting on the sofa, and Richard was sitting on the floor. His head was resting entirely in her lap, and she was gently stroking his hair. It was an incredibly intimate, tender scene. It was miles away from a normal familial dynamic. I felt a knot form in my stomach. My throat went completely dry. But once again, I blamed myself for being overly sensitive and reading too much into things. Perhaps in some affluent, expressive families, affection was shown in such a close, tactile manner. I forced myself to find excuses to protect their image and to calm my own racing mind. But my suspicions were absolutely confirmed when my sister-in-law, Emily, left for a week-long corporate business trip to Seattle. During that week, Richard came over to our house for dinner almost every single night. His excuse was that he felt lonely in his big, empty house and wanted to have dinner with his mother-in-law. Eleanor couldn't hide her sheer joy. She cooked massive feasts and catered to him more passionately than she ever did for her own son. Every night, they would sit in the living room and talk until past midnight. Their hushed giggles and laughter would drift all the way up to my bedroom. One night, I went down to the kitchen to get a glass of water because I was incredibly thirsty. It was past midnight. I stopped dead in my tracks when I saw that the door to my mother-in-law's master bedroom was slightly ajar. And inside, I could clearly make out the silhouettes of two people intertwined. In that exact moment, I felt my heart stop beating. I sprinted back to my bedroom. My mind was flooded with sheer horror and disgust. I knew I had to tell Michael, but I also knew Michael would never believe me. He would think I was inventing malicious lies out of jealousy just to hurt his mother. He would just tell me again that I was overthinking things and being too sensitive. The absolute peak of my suspicion arrived on the day of my mother-in-law's birthday. Michael and I had pooled our money to buy her a very expensive designer silk scarf. But when we presented it to her, she accepted it with blatant indifference. She offered a stiff, formal thank you and immediately tossed it aside. When it was Richard's turn, he handed her a stunning, vintage emerald and gold bracelet. Eleanor was so ecstatic, she practically threw herself at him to hug him. She slipped the bracelet onto her wrist and kept admiring and caressing it for the entire night. Later that evening, after all the guests had left, I accidentally walked past my mother-in-law's bedroom. The door wasn't fully shut. I heard her talking to someone on her cell phone. Her voice was incredibly flirty, breathless, and sweet. "Thank you for the gift. I absolutely love it. It's a shame you aren't here tonight." I froze. This tone of voice clearly belonged to a woman speaking to her secret lover. But who was the man? It couldn't be. A horrifying thought sliced through my brain, sending violent shivers down my spine. From that moment on, I knew I could no longer stay silent. I wasn't doing this for revenge. I needed the truth. I needed a concrete explanation for the insane toxicity happening inside this house. I needed an insurance policy to protect myself from these hypocritical, dangerous people. And that was when the idea of installing a hidden camera in the living room began taking shape in my mind. It was an incredibly risky decision, but I knew it was the only way to peel back their masks and expose their true faces. Making the decision to install a hidden camera wasn't easy. In those days, my mind was a chaotic storm of emotions. There was a paralyzing fear of what might happen if I were discovered. They certainly wouldn't let me walk away unscathed. My mother-in-law, with her ruthless and domineering nature, was capable of doing absolutely anything to silence me and ruin my life. There was also the profound disgust of knowing I had to actively investigate and witness the filthy, depraved acts happening under the very roof where I slept. And there was also a lingering trace of guilt because I had to resort to a dishonest method, invading the privacy of others. But all those doubts quickly evaporated. I remembered the indifferent, emotionally dead look in my husband's eyes. Every time I tried to speak up about the blatant injustice I endured. Every time his mother hurled baseless insults at me, he just stayed silent or worse. He advised me to just suck it up and endure it to keep the peace in the house. I remembered the image of my mother-in-law spitting insults at me, treating me like an unpaid, live-in maid. And the image of my brother-in-law, with his hypocritical, charming smile and his calculating, silver-tongued words. All of this completely erased any hesitation I had left. I knew that if I didn't save myself, no one else was going to come to my rescue. In this sick game, I had no allies except myself. I spent several nights scouring the internet, carefully researching different types of hidden spy cameras. I needed to pick one that was entirely undetectable, but still offered high-quality video resolution. Ultimately, I ordered a model that was disguised as a tiny screw. It boasted full 1080p HD quality, a highly sensitive built-in microphone for audio recording, and most importantly, a Wi-Fi connection that allowed me to monitor the live feed straight from an app on my phone, no matter where I was. I paid for it using the small amount of cash I had saved in my emergency fund. Money I had secretly tucked away without Michael's knowledge for unexpected expenses. I had originally intended to use that money to help my parents back in my hometown. But now, I had to use it to secure my own survival. The actual installation posed another massive problem. I had to pick a time when the entire family was out of the house. Luckily, that very weekend, my husband's family had to drive out of state to attend the funeral of a distant relative. For me, this was a golden opportunity. That Saturday, I was home alone all day, holding my breath. I decided to install the camera into the top wooden frame of the massive, expensive landscape painting hanging in the living room, perfectly disguised as a nail embedded in the wood. From this elevated vantage point, I had a sweeping view of the entire living space, especially the large sectional sofa where my mother-in-law and brother-in-law usually sat and chatted. I fussed with the installation for hours, my hands shaking and my heart pounding against my ribs. Every time I heard a strange noise outside, every time a delivery truck drove past the house, I jolted in terror, terrified that someone had suddenly come back. Finally, after a long, nerve-wracking effort, the installation was complete. I opened my phone and connected to the camera feed. The image was crystal clear, and the audio pickup was excellent. I breathed a massive sigh of relief, yet a heavy, sinking feeling of anxiety settled deep in the corner of my heart. I had officially crossed over into a dark world I had never, ever wanted to know about. For the first few days, the camera didn't record anything out of the ordinary. The daily routine of the house flowed on as usual. My mother-in-law was still exceptionally cruel to me. Michael remained as indifferent and spineless as ever, and my brother-in-law dropped by occasionally, still playing the role of the model son-in-law in front of everyone. For a brief moment, I actually thought that maybe I really was just paranoid. Maybe this was all just a product of my overactive imagination. Maybe the shadowy scene I saw in my mother-in-law's bedroom that night was just a trick of the light. But on a Wednesday afternoon, while I was sitting at my desk in the office, my phone vibrated with a motion detection alert. The camera had picked up movement in the living room. I quickly opened the app to check the live feed. I felt my heart plummet into my stomach. On the screen were my mother-in-law and Richard, sitting on the sofa. At first, they were just chatting normally. But moments later, Richard's behavior shifted into something highly intimate. He wrapped his arm tightly around her waist and leaned in to whisper something directly into her ear. Eleanor didn't push him away or resist in the slightest. Instead, she rested her head on his shoulder, wearing a deeply satisfied, euphoric smile. I felt violently nauseous and couldn't bear to watch another second. I locked my phone, sprinted to the office restroom, and threw up everything in my stomach. The reality was so much more repulsive than I had ever imagined. But it didn't stop there. Over the following days, the camera captured countless, increasingly horrific scenes. They hugged and kissed passionately on the very same sofa where the whole family usually gathered to watch TV. They whispered things to each other and engaged in acts that only clandestine lovers would do. And the absolute climax occurred on a day when Emily and Michael were both out of the house. They shamelessly had sex right there in the living room. I had to watch all of this unfold through the glowing screen of my phone, sitting in total isolation, in silence, and consumed by absolute dread. I downloaded and saved all of these video files. I made several backup copies and stored them in secure cloud drives. I knew this was my ultimate weapon. My only ticket out of this living hell. But I didn't act immediately. I waited. I bided my time, waiting for the perfect opportunity. The exact moment when the final drop would make the glass overflow. I didn't want to be the one to declare war. I wanted them their own arrogance and cruelty to light the match of their own destruction. And on that New Year's Eve, when Michael raised his grandfather's leather belt to strike me, and my mother-in-law stood there screaming and falsely accusing me, I knew my moment had finally arrived. Now that the truth was laid bare, there was no going back. The living room was no longer a warm, cozy place for a holiday gathering. It had transformed into a brutal courtroom where everyone was forced to stand trial before their own conscience. And I, the falsely accused, had inadvertently become the judge, jury, and executioner. The television screen remained paused on the most humiliating, indisputable frame. The silence in the living room was now far more terrifying than the screaming had been. It was like the eerie calm at the eye of a hurricane, where everyone knew catastrophic destruction was inevitable, but absolutely no one could stop it. The first person to break the silence was my mother-in-law, Eleanor. But not with words. A sudden surge of madness, profound shame, and sheer terror morphed her into an irrational beast. She twisted her body wildly. She grabbed an expensive, imported porcelain vase from the side table and raised it to hurl it at the flat-screen TV, as if destroying the monitor would somehow magically erase the evidence of her sins. "I'll smash it. I'm going to kill you." But before she could launch it, a hand shot out and clamped down hard on her wrist. It was my sister-in-law, Emily. In the 5 years of my marriage, this was the very first time I had ever seen her act with such fierce determination. The docile, submissive woman who lived entirely inside the shell of the perfect wife and mother was gone. "That's enough, Mom. How much more are you going to humiliate yourself in front of everyone?" Her voice shook violently, but it was laced with pure, unadulterated rage. Tears were still streaming down her face. But in her eyes, there wasn't just heartbreak, there was wrath. She turned to the man standing next to her, who was frozen like a deer in headlights, the husband she had loved and blindly trusted. "And you, Richard. How did this happen? You and my mother. The two of you." The agonizing pain choked her throat, and she couldn't even finish the sentence. It was a question she probably wished she never had to utter in her entire life. Richard seemed to suddenly snap out of his trance. He frantically dropped to his knees right in front of Emily. He desperately grabbed her legs and began sobbing pathetically. He immediately launched into another act of his theatrical performance. "Emily, please forgive me. Please. Your mother forced me into this. This is all her fault. She seduced me. I'm just a victim." His words, so incredibly cowardly and shameless, shocked everyone in the room. Even I, who knew him to be a manipulative sociopath under his refined exterior, didn't think he was capable of stooping this low. To save his own skin, he was perfectly willing to throw all the blame onto his mother-in-law, his secret lover. He actually tried to paint himself as a helpless victim, a weak man who simply couldn't resist the aggressive seduction of an older woman. Upon hearing this, Eleanor threw her head back and began laughing like a total lunatic. Her manic, pathetic cackling echoed off the walls. "A victim? You're a victim? Damn you to hell. You were the one sneaking into my room, seducing me with your sweet talk. You were the one who complained that your wife was always depressed and boring, and that you only felt like a real man when you were with me," she screamed, pointing her finger directly into Richard's pale face. "And now you're trying to pin all the blame on me?" The explosive argument between the two adulterers turned the elegant living room into a trashy reality show. They hurled vile insults at each other, publicly humiliating themselves and airing out their dirtiest, most depraved secrets right in front of all their relatives. It quickly became apparent that their affair wasn't just some twisted romance. There were calculations, transactions, and promises involved. It turned out, Richard had been using his mother-in-law's vast network to secure lucrative corporate favors and investments. And Eleanor had found in her son-in-law the physical validation and satisfaction her late husband had never given her. This incestuous drama devolved into a pathetic farce of mutual accusations. Amidst the absolute chaos, my husband, Michael, finally reacted. He stood up slowly and walked over to his mother. But he didn't say a single word. He just stared at her with a chillingly hollow, empty gaze. It was the look of a son whose core foundation, his entire faith in the mother he once worshipped, had been completely annihilated. Then, he turned to look at me. His expression was a chaotic mess. A mix of immense shame, deep regret, and something that looked a lot like pleading. He opened his mouth, his voice hoarse and broken. "Mia. But I didn't let him finish. I was far too exhausted for last-minute apologies and hypocritical displays of remorse. I cut him off, my tone ice cold. What are you going to say? Are you going to apologize, or pretend you had absolutely no idea? Michael, stop fooling yourself. You're her son. You've lived in this house your whole life. Did you really never notice anything strange? Or maybe you did know. Maybe you knew, but you chose to stay silent because you're a spineless coward who never had the guts to face the ugly truth. My words acted like the final dagger plunging into his bleeding heart. Michael flinched violently. He couldn't form a single word in his defense. He understood that I had seen right through his facade. His silence, his perpetual indifference toward my suffering over the years, it wasn't just ignorance. It was complicity. The screaming match between Eleanor and Richard raged on with even greater ferocity. The relatives, who had previously acted as eager spectators to my proposed downfall, began murmuring among themselves. My God, I can't believe this. What an absolute scandal. This is a stain on the family's legacy. How are we ever going to show our faces at the club again? Poor Mia, God only knows what she had to endure over these past 5 years. The pendulum of public opinion had completely swung to my side. They no longer looked at me with contempt, but with profound sympathy, and even a begrudging sense of respect. I was no longer isolated. The trial of the family was coming to a close, but the trial of society was only just beginning. And in the wake of this tidal wave, certain people were going to pay an astronomical price for their sins. The chaotic screaming match between my mother-in-law and brother-in-law only ceased when Uncle Robert, the eldest and most authoritative patriarch of the extended family, couldn't take it anymore and slammed his heavy fist down on the dining table. Enough. All of you, shut your mouths, he bellowed. Turning this house into a filthy swamp on New Year's Eve, right in front of the memory of our ancestors. What an absolute disgrace. His booming, dominant roar silenced the room instantly. Eleanor and Richard stopped screaming at each other, though they continued to exchange glares filled with venomous hatred. The anger toward the person who had just thrown them under the bus was now far stronger than their own sense of shame. The room plunged back into a deathly silence, interrupted only by Emily's jagged, shallow breathing and quiet sobs. Uncle Robert was Michael's late father's older brother. A strict, highly moralistic man who was deeply respected in their social circles. He was always the designated mediator for any family disputes, big or small. Uncle Robert turned to me. In his eyes, there was no longer any questioning, only a mix of genuine apology and a heavy dose of guilt. Mia, my child, I have no words. On behalf of this entire family, I beg for your forgiveness. You have suffered far too much injustice. I gave a slight, acknowledging nod but said nothing. This apology, even though it was years too late, brought me a tiny sliver of comfort. It showed that within this corrupt family, there was at least one person who still knew how to distinguish right from wrong. That I wasn't totally crazy for seeing their hypocrisy. Uncle Robert then turned his piercing gaze to Michael, adopting the strict tone of a patriarch. And you, Michael, as a husband and the supposed man of this house, how could you let something so repulsive happen under your roof? Instead of protecting your wife, you acted recklessly and cruelly, almost committing an unforgivable sin tonight with that belt. Do you even consider yourself a man? Do you think your late father, Arthur, would be able to rest in peace if he saw what you've done? Every word he spoke felt like an invisible whip lashing at Michael's conscience. Michael hung his head low, his shoulders shaking uncontrollably. He couldn't refute a single word. Everything Uncle Robert said was the undeniable truth. He was a colossal failure of a husband, a blind son, and an absolute coward. After a minute of heavy silence, Uncle Robert, in a desperate, final attempt to salvage the situation and protect the family's prestige, made a ruling. Well, since things have escalated to this point, we obviously can't hide it. We will resolve this quietly, strictly within the family, so we don't become a laughingstock in the community. Eleanor and Richard's vile actions will be dealt with and punished by the family board tomorrow. And as for your marriage, Michael, you will formally apologize to Mia, and you will treat her like an absolute queen from this day forward. You are never to let her suffer another ounce of disrespect again. Uncle Robert's words sounded like a final verdict, a desperate attempt to patch the gaping holes in a sinking ship. Everyone in the room seemed to think this was a highly reasonable compromise. They fully expected me to accept this grand apology, continue playing my role in this marriage, and bury the secret in silence, just like countless other injustices that women are historically expected to endure. But once again, they were dead wrong. I had stayed completely silent for 5 years. I had endured everything right up to my absolute breaking point. If I staged a rebellion tonight, it wasn't to extract a hollow apology or to continue surviving in a rotten, toxic marriage. I did it to reclaim my absolute freedom and my dignity. I took a deep breath and looked directly at Uncle Robert. My voice was calm, yet unyielding. Uncle Robert, I truly appreciate your kind words. But I cannot accept this decision. A new wave of shocked murmurs rippled through the room. No one could believe I actually had the audacity to publicly reject the patriarch's ruling. This is no longer just a private family issue. This has crossed the boundaries of a marriage. It has completely shattered the boundaries of basic human decency. I refuse to spend another second living in an environment poisoned by lies, manipulation, and perversion. I am filing for a divorce. The word divorce slipped effortlessly from my lips, but it carried the devastating shockwave of a detonating bomb. Michael's head snapped up instantly. His eyes were wide with sheer disbelief. Mia, what are you saying? No, please. I've been a total idiot. I'll fix everything, I swear. Can't you just give me one more chance? He rushed toward me, desperately trying to grab my hands. But I took a swift step back, out of his reach. A chance? How many chances have I silently given you over the last 5 years? Were you ever truly on my side, even once? Or did you always just hide behind your mother's skirt, watching as she humiliated me, watching as she insulted my background, never once stepping up to defend me? Michael, my love for you is dead. It died the exact second you raised that belt to beat me. My love is not some cheap toy that you can discard and pick back up whenever it's convenient for you. It was trampled on by you and your family until there was absolutely nothing left. I turned to face everyone in the room, all those shocked, paralyzed, pale faces, and delivered my final decree. And just so you all know, I am not deleting this video. It is already in the hands of my lawyer. If anyone in this family, and I mean anyone, dares to interfere with my life, my divorce proceedings, or my exit from this house, I will not hesitate for a single second to leak this video to the press, the country club, and the entire world. My statement, firm and totally unshakable, officially put an end to the charade. I was no longer a pawn on their chessboard, I was the one controlling the board. I had chosen my own path. A path entirely free from their dark shadows. But were they going to let me walk away that easily? And would my battle to reclaim my freedom really end without a fight? My uncompromising demand for a divorce and the looming threat of publishing the video backed the family into an impossible corner. They couldn't force me to stay. They knew I was no longer the docile, domesticated sheep I used to be. The fire raging inside me was entirely capable of burning down anyone who tried to extinguish it. But they also couldn't just let me go easily, because if this horrific, incestuous secret got out, it would utterly obliterate the social standing and prestige they valued far more than their own lives. That New Year's Eve concluded in a heavy, oppressive atmosphere, stripped of any festive spirit. The relatives hurried to grab their coats and left, whispering furiously among themselves, shooting me glances that were an odd mixture of sympathy and morbid curiosity. I had instantly become the epicenter of their family tragedy, and this scandalous story was guaranteed to be on the tip of everyone's tongue for a very long time. I packed my bags that exact same night. I didn't have much to take, just my clothes and a few personal items. I had lived in this massive colonial house for 5 years, but I realized how shockingly few things actually belonged to me. Everything in this house, from the expensive mahogany furniture to the smallest decorative vases, was purchased by my mother-in-law, and she had never missed an opportunity to remind me of that fact to assert her dominance. As I wheeled my suitcase toward the grand front double doors, Michael blocked my path. He no longer possessed the aggressive, cruel demeanor from earlier, he just looked pathetic and utterly destroyed. His eyes were bloodshot and severely swollen. "Mia, please don't leave. I know I have absolutely no right to stop you. But can't we just wait a little while? Can't we sit down and talk about this?" I looked at him with entirely hollow eyes. My heart was completely frozen. "There is nothing left to talk about, Michael. Everything is crystal clear. Step aside." But Michael refused to move. He dropped to his knees right there in the foyer, wrapped his arms around my legs, and began bawling like a child. "Please, Mia, please. I can't live without you. You are everything to me. I know I've been stupid. I let my mom get in my head, and I accused you over a stupid text. Forgive me. If you leave, what's going to happen to me?" I felt a sickening cocktail of disbelief and slight disgust. I was everything to him? If I was everything to him, why did he never protect me? If I was everything to him, why did he want to whip me with a leather belt over a generic holiday greeting? If I was everything to him, why did he force me to face his mother's relentless cruelty alone for 5 agonizing years? I firmly pried his hands off my legs and said coldly, "It's not that you can't live without me. You're just terrified. You're terrified of the truth getting out. You're terrified of losing face in your country club. You're terrified of facing the catastrophic consequences of what your family has done. You don't love me, Michael. The only person you love is yourself." After delivering those final words, I pushed past him, opened the heavy oak door, and walked out into the freezing Chicago night, dragging my suitcase behind me without looking back a single time. His hysterical, sobbing pleas echoed behind me, but they completely failed to move a heart that had already turned to stone. I hailed an Uber and temporarily crashed at a good friend's apartment in the city. I didn't want to go straight back to my parents' house in a different state just yet, to avoid worrying them. I needed time to decompress, center myself, and organize my thoughts. The very next morning, I contacted a top-tier family law firm in downtown Chicago. I laid out the entire story to them and handed over a copy of the video as my trump card. My attorney, a sharp, middle-aged woman with decades of experience in high net worth, contentious divorces, watched the footage and bluntly told me this was one of the most bizarre and explosive cases she had ever handled. She promised to fast-track my divorce proceedings and aggressively leverage the evidence to guarantee I got everything I was entitled to. Meanwhile, back at the estate, another vicious war was raging. According to a friend who lived in the same gated community, right after I left, my mother-in-law and brother-in-law resumed ripping each other to shreds. My sister-in-law Emily, after crying all night until she physically had no tears left, immediately filed for divorce as well. She packed her bags, took her young son, and moved in with a friend. She absolutely refused to spend another second under the same roof as her cheating husband and her repulsive mother. Richard, having been abandoned by his wife and completely ostracized by the family, spiraled into ruin. He started drinking heavily every single day. He completely abandoned his corporate duties. As for Eleanor, having lost the trust of her son, her daughter, and her precious son-in-law, she suffered a complete mental breakdown. She didn't dare step foot outside the house. She couldn't stomach the thought of facing the vicious gossip of her wealthy neighbors. She locked herself in her master bedroom all day, wailing and complaining to the walls. The once glorious, bustling suburban mansion devolved into a freezing, dark, and utterly lifeless mausoleum. My soon-to-be ex-husband, Michael, had to bear the entire weight of this catastrophe alone. He had to care for his mentally deteriorating mother, deal with my aggressive divorce lawyers, and endure the mocking stares of his relatives and neighbors. He called me dozens of times and flooded my phone with desperate texts, begging me to come back, but I never responded to a single one. Eventually, I blocked his number. I was done listening to his lies. They were finally paying the price for their sins. But was this really the end? When a family built entirely on hypocrisy and lies begins to collapse, it is impossible to stop the momentum. In the days that followed, I lived in the profound peace I had craved for years. I read books, listened to music, and took long walks in the park despite the winter chill. I relearned how to take care of myself, how to love myself. I realized that for the past 5 years, I had been living entirely for other people, sacrificing my own identity for the sake of a family that was, in reality, nothing but a gilded cage trapping me in prejudice and toxic, outdated rules. Now, standing outside that cage, I finally understood what true freedom felt like, what it meant to take a deep breath of clean, untainted air. The divorce process in the United States is rarely easy, especially when assets are involved. It took several grueling months of legal maneuvering before I finally secured my freedom. It was not a walk in the park between the exorbitant legal fees and the emotional exhaustion of having my wounds reopened during depositions to prove Michael's extreme cruelty and at-fault behavior. But because I possessed that damning video, Michael's highly paid lawyers were completely paralyzed. Terrified that this grotesque, incestuous scandal would inevitably leak to the public records and the press, Michael was forced to yield. To ensure my absolute silence and guarantee I wouldn't publish the video, he signed a highly lucrative out-of-court settlement in my favor. He handed over the lion's share of our joint marital assets, plus a massive lump sum alimony payment to help me rebuild my life. He didn't even try to appeal or fight the demands. Our marriage ended abruptly and ice-cold. He probably realized that there was absolutely no room for negotiation with a heart he had personally turned to stone. During our final moment in the mediator's office, I didn't even glance in his direction. Every stroke of the pen on those legal documents served as the final nail in the coffin of our relationship. The freedom I had achieved after so many years was not just a stack of legal papers, it was my rebirth as a completely independent, empowered woman. Following the finalization of the divorce, I decided to start a brand new life using the settlement money that I rightfully deserved. I didn't want to move back to my hometown and become a burden to my parents. I wanted to stand firmly on my own 2 feet. I leased a beautiful, sunlit luxury apartment in downtown Chicago and decorated it entirely to my own taste, using warm, vibrant colors. I landed a fantastic new job at a top-tier corporate communications firm, a career path I was genuinely passionate about, where I could actually utilize my degree and hone my skills. My life slowly but surely began to stabilize. I made wonderful new friends. I built a brand new network. I was no longer the submissive, endlessly patient Mia from the past. I was a free, self-sufficient, and genuinely happy woman. I relearned how to smile, a true, authentic smile that radiated from the heart. Meanwhile, the tragedy of my former in-laws had not concluded. The incestuous scandal, despite their desperate, expensive attempts to suppress it, ultimately leaked out anyway. You can't hide a rotting corpse forever. The relatives who were present on that fateful New Year's Eve, despite being sworn to absolute secrecy, simply couldn't keep such a juicy, horrifying story to themselves. They whispered it to one person, who whispered it to another. Before long, the entire gated community knew, and soon, their entire country club and social circle in the city were gossiping about it. The social prestige they valued so deeply was entirely obliterated. My former brother-in-law, Richard, after weeks of chronic alcoholism and erratic behavior, was unceremoniously fired from his executive position. Not a single respectable firm in the city wanted to hire a man burdened with such a toxic, repulsive scandal. Having lost his lucrative job, his family, and his dignity, he simply couldn't handle the fall from grace. He sought total refuge in the bottom of a liquor bottle. Until one night, while driving heavily intoxicated, he caused a horrific accident and struck a pedestrian. That DUI collision landed him straight in a state penitentiary. And just like that, the life of a man who was once universally praised as the model of success and sophistication came to a humiliating, permanent end. My former sister-in-law, Emily, struggled immensely after her divorce. She had to navigate raising her young son as a single mother while actively fighting off the vicious prejudices and whispers of their social circle. But perhaps, for her, this was an ultimate liberation. She no longer had to live under the hypocritical, oppressive thumb of her toxic family. She launched an online e-commerce boutique that, while demanding, allowed her to achieve financial independence. Occasionally, she would send me a text to check in and see how I was doing. In those messages, the bitter sarcasm and disdain of the past were entirely gone, replaced by genuine sympathy and a small measure of gratitude. She admitted that I had helped her clearly see the true, monstrous faces of the people she had blindly trusted. As for Eleanor, after enduring so much public humiliation and trauma, she spiraled into severe clinical depression. She completely lost her sharp, calculating sanity. She spent her days wandering the house, muttering nonsensical things to herself and talking to ghosts. Michael was forced to restrict her to the first floor and hire a full-time, live-in caregiver to manage her. The sprawling, luxurious two-story colonial mansion had effectively morphed into a cold, dark, suburban prison. Michael lived there in absolute isolation, tending to a mother who didn't even recognize him half the time. He ultimately had to sell off large portions of their stock portfolios and take out a second mortgage on the estate just to pay for his mother's astronomical psychiatric care and to help settle the massive civil lawsuit brought by the Fadi, victim of Richard's drunk driving accident. His life devolved into a bleak, endless series of hopeless, miserable days. Everyone had received the exact ending they deserved for their vile actions. But the story wasn't quite over yet. There was still one person who had inflicted the most profound, lingering pain upon me who had not yet received his ultimate judgment. I'm talking about my ex-husband, Michael. Even though he was already bearing the crushing weight of isolation, profound regret, and the financial ruin of his shattered family, I felt it wasn't enough of a punishment for what he did to me. He wasn't the mastermind behind the perverse, incestuous affair. But his chronic cowardice and calculated indifference provided the fertile soil that allowed all this evil to thrive. If he had simply protected me from the very beginning, if he had just listened to me, if he had trusted me, this entire tragedy might never have happened. He could have intervened and stopped his mother and brother-in-law's inappropriate relationship. He could have given me a genuine, loving home. But he didn't do any of that. He chose the cowardly silence of indifference and eagerly sacrificed me on the altar of his fake, domestic peace. I didn't hate him anymore. When love dies, hatred loses its purpose. Harboring a grudge would only exhaust my own soul. But I needed him to truly, deeply comprehend the agonizing pain I had endured. I needed him to taste exactly what it felt like when the entire world turned its back on you, when the person closest to you betrays you in the most intimate way. I needed him to confront his own cowardly nature and feel soul-crushing remorse for his unforgivable mistakes. And I knew exactly how to execute this, not through violence or loud, public revenge, but through a deeply calculated, agonizing psychological strike. I still had a digital copy of that horrific video. I had assumed I would never have to use it again, that it would remain a buried, encrypted secret. But now, I had a different idea. I wasn't going to publish it to the general public. Doing that would just make me exactly like them, someone who feeds off the morbid curiosity of the masses by airing dirty laundry. I was only going to send it to one specific person. One person I knew possessed the power to deliver a lethal, emotional death blow to Michael. A blow far more agonizing than losing his wealth, his reputation, or the respect of society. That person was Michael's late father, Arthur, who had passed away a year before my nightmare truly began. It sounds completely insane, right? How can you send an email to a dead man? But I knew there was a way to deliver this video directly to him. A way to make his father's booming voice and strict moral teachings echo violently inside Michael's consciousness. When my father-in-law was alive, he was an incredibly strict, patriarchal figure. He was a retired high school principal who viewed a family's honor, integrity, and human morality as the absolute highest virtues. He had lectured Michael endlessly about a husband's sacred duties and the core responsibilities of being a real man. And I knew he had a very close, lifelong best friend, a man with whom he shared all his deepest secrets. This was Uncle Nicholas, a fellow retired educator and former neighbor of my in-laws, who had moved to a different state in the Pacific Northwest shortly after my father-in-law's passing. They had been inseparable best friends who spent countless weekends drinking black drip coffee, playing chess, and sharing stories on the back patio. It took a bit of digging to track down Uncle Nicholas. Eventually, through an old mutual acquaintance, I managed to get his cell phone number. I called him and politely introduced myself as the former daughter-in-law of his best friend, Arthur. I laid out the entire, unfiltered story to him, sparing absolutely no gruesome details. Initially, Uncle Nicholas flat out refused to believe me. He couldn't fathom that something so depraved and vile could occur within the family of a man he so deeply respected. In his memories, Eleanor was still the rational, devoted wife, and Michael was the dutiful, obedient son. But when I emailed him the encrypted video file to watch for himself, he was rendered entirely speechless. He told me his eyes were bloodshot and his hands were shaking violently. He whispered into the phone, "If my dear friend were alive today, he wouldn't survive this blow. He would instantly disown his wife and his son. He would consider this the greatest, most unforgivable shame of his entire existence." I asked Uncle Nicholas for one final, crucial favor. I asked him to deliver this video to Michael, but not via a casual email or a text message. I wanted him to fly down to Chicago and show it to him in person, specifically on the anniversary of my father-in-law's death. I wanted Michael, on the very day he was meant to honor the sacred memory of his late father, to be forced to confront the most shameful, disgusting reality about the family he failed to protect. I wanted him to feel the crushing weight of remorse standing right in front of his father's memorial, realizing exactly what his cowardice had allowed to fester. I wanted the strict moral teachings of the father he so deeply revered to morph into the ultimate judge, jury, and executioner, condemning his soul. It was a ruthlessly cruel act of revenge. But I felt zero remorse, because I knew this was the only way to awaken a man who had spent his entire life asleep in a bed of cowardice and apathy. The anniversary of my late father-in-law's passing fell during a particularly brutal stretch of autumn. It was a freezing, dreary October day, with relentless, pouring rain. The dark, melancholic atmosphere seemed to perfectly mourn the total collapse of this family. I obviously did not attend the memorial. My ties to that family had been permanently severed. But deep in my heart, a faint pulse of anticipation fluttered. I kept asking myself, will my plan work as intended? Will this final, psychological strike pierce the deepest depths of Michael's soul? That evening, as I sat alone in my cozy, warm apartment, sipping a mug of hot chamomile tea, my cell phone rang. It was an unknown out-of-state number. I hesitated for a brief second before answering. On the other end of the line, I heard the calm, deeply sorrowful voice of Uncle Nicholas, heavy with exhaustion. "Mia, I did exactly what you asked." He proceeded to tell me exactly what had transpired that afternoon. Michael had set up a modest memorial display in the grand, now freezing, and empty living room. Only a handful of loyal relatives, who still harbored some pity for the disgraced family, bothered to show up. Eleanor was heavily sedated under the care of her nurse and didn't make an appearance, and Emily had outright refused to attend. The atmosphere of the memorial was impossibly dark and suffocating, a stark contrast to the grand, lavish gatherings of previous years when the family was still perched on their high horse of respectability. After everyone paid their respects, Uncle Nicholas quietly pulled Michael aside and asked him to step out onto the covered back patio, away from the guests. He didn't waste time with small talk. He simply handed Michael his iPad and pressed play on the video file. He told him that there was something he needed to see, something Michael, and undoubtedly his father, needed to witness. At first, Michael was just confused. He didn't understand what he was looking at. He probably assumed Uncle Nicholas had digitized some old home movies or photos of his dad. But when the first clear frame loaded, the blood completely drained from his face. He froze in sheer terror. His eyes were glued to the tablet screen. He watched the footage loop, seemingly unable to process or believe what his own eyes were showing him. Uncle Nicholas said Michael's entire body began to shake violently, not out of rage, but out of agonizing pain and unfathomable shame. He then looked up at Uncle Nicholas, his eyes overflowing with pure, unfiltered despair. Where did you get this?" Michael choked out. Uncle Nicholas replied quietly, his voice heavy with the weight of his age. "Mia sent this to me. She told me she wanted you, standing right here in front of your father's spirit, to see with your own two eyes exactly what this family devolved into. She wanted you to ask yourself a question: what would your father feel if he were alive to see this?" Uncle Nicholas's words acted like a serrated dagger twisting into Michael's already shattered heart. The image of his strict, yet deeply loving father. His father's endless lectures about human morality, accountability, and the honor of the family name, all of it rushed into his mind like a devastating flood. He couldn't hold it in any longer. He began to sob hysterically, wailing like a broken child. His legs gave out, and he collapsed onto the patio floor. He buried his face in his hands and wept uncontrollably in the backyard of his ruined estate, right in front of the horrified, lingering relatives. It was the first time in many, many years that anyone had seen Michael cry. These were his final tears, but perhaps they were finally tears of genuine realization. He stayed on the ground weeping for a long time, completely ignoring the fact that the wind had picked up, blowing the freezing rain sideways and soaking him to the bone. Uncle Nicholas told me that from that specific day forward, Michael fundamentally changed. He never once tried to contact or cling to me again. He finally accepted reality. He accepted his punishment. He sent me one final text message containing only 2 words, "Forgive me." I didn't reply, but I knew that this time, the apology was profoundly sincere. He eventually sold the massive 2-story colonial mansion. A large chunk of the equity went directly into paying for his mother's permanent stay at a specialized psychiatric facility, and he wired the rest of the funds to Emily to help her raise her son. With the meager amount of money he had left over, he rented a tiny, cramped studio apartment in a rougher part of town and lived a quiet, entirely solitary life. He took a grueling night shift job and worked relentlessly to earn an honest living, desperately trying to atone for his monumental failures. He was no longer Michael, the arrogant heir of a prestigious, wealthy family. He was just an ordinary, broken man trying to live by his conscience so as not to bring any further shame to his late father's legacy. After hearing Uncle Nicholas's account, I didn't feel a rush of schadenfreude or vindictive joy. I simply felt a strange, profound sense of peace. It was finally, truly over. Everyone had found their destined path. No matter how agonizing or brutal the journey had been, I was no longer chained to the past. I was fully ready to move forward and write a brilliant new chapter in my life. A chapter totally devoid of dark shadows, gaslighting, and betrayal. My story, a saga drenched in tragedy and tears, had finally reached its conclusion. But it wasn't a fairy tale happily ever after, where everything is magically perfect. It was a realistic, gritty resolution. An ending where justice ultimately prevailed, and everyone was forced to learn their own incredibly costly lessons. As time marched on, the deep scars on my heart began to fade and heal. I learned how to forgive not for their sake, but for my own. I forgave so I wouldn't have to carry the suffocating weight of the past on my shoulders, allowing me to live a lighter, more serene life. I forgave my own past naivety and foolishness for placing my trust in the wrong people. I forgave my own weakness and my tendency to be submissive, for staying silent and enduring the abuse for far too long. I finally understood that hoarding resentment would only poison my own soul, and in the end, the only person I would be hurting was myself. My life today is incredibly peaceful. My career at the communications firm is flourishing beautifully. My executives trust my instincts and hand me high-profile, critical projects. My colleagues genuinely value and respect me for my skills and my integrity. Through my own relentless hard work and savings, I eventually bought my own luxury condo, a true sanctuary that belongs solely to me. There, I can be my absolute, authentic self, totally free from the judging eyes or pressure of anyone else. I also began to open my heart again. I stopped being terrified of love and refused to lose my faith in men entirely. I joined local book clubs and engaged in various social activities. I took up hot yoga classes to improve both my physical health and my mental flexibility. I built a tribe of amazing new friends who helped me rediscover the pure joy and vibrant meaning of life. And during one of my book club meetings, I met a wonderfully kind, warm-hearted man who slowly melted away the remaining ice around my heart. He is my current husband. He's a successful architect, 5 years older than me, and he had also gone through a brutal divorce due to the extreme psychological toxicity of his ex-wife. Perhaps that shared trauma is exactly why he understood and empathized so deeply with everything I had survived. My dark past didn't matter to him in the slightest. What mattered to him was my character, who I am today. He showed me what true, unconditional love and mutual respect actually look like, something I had never, ever experienced in my previous marriage. We decided to build a life together, creating a small, beautiful, and joyous home rooted firmly in absolute trust, respect, and profound understanding. Occasionally, through the grapevine of old mutual acquaintances, I still hear faint updates about my former in-laws. Eleanor, after a lengthy, intensive stint in the psychiatric hospital, was eventually discharged. But she is a ghost of the sharp-tongued, domineering matriarch she used to be. Her mind is fractured. Some days she is lucid, and other days she is lost in a fog, unable to even recognize Michael. Michael continues to care for her entirely on his own, doing so quietly and without a single complaint. He works his grueling night shifts and spends his days managing his mother's meals, medications, and doctor's appointments. Some people say this is his ultimate penance, and perhaps it is. He is paying the steep price for his past cowardice by finally stepping up and accepting the heavy responsibilities of a son, responsibilities he should have embraced long before everything fell apart. Emily remained in the city with her son after her divorce, completely cutting off all contact with her toxic mother and brother. She secured a stable, high-paying corporate job in the fashion industry. And from what I've heard, she recently met a good, honest man who loves and protects both her and her son fiercely. I am genuinely happy for her. She deserves to find happiness after the hell she was dragged through. And my former brother-in-law, Richard, after being released from state prison, he vanished without a single trace. No one in Chicago knows where he went or what he's doing to survive. He likely had no face left to show the world. A man who once had the world in the palm of his hands, a stellar career, a beautiful family, prestige, and honor. In the end, he lost absolutely everything because he couldn't control his own vile, base desires. One weekend afternoon, while my husband and I were out shopping for groceries at a local supermarket to stock up our new home, I unexpectedly ran into Michael. He was working as a delivery driver for a logistics company, diligently loading heavy cardboard boxes of produce onto a worn-out delivery cart. He was wearing a faded, standard-issue uniform, and his face looked incredibly gaunt and exhausted. He appeared to have aged at least a decade. As we crossed paths in the aisle, our eyes accidentally met. In that brief, fleeting second, I saw a flash of intense shame, confusion, and profound regret wash over his eyes. I acknowledged him with a very slight, polite nod of my head, a brief greeting totally devoid of any malice, anger, or hatred. And then I walked away, smiling brightly, holding on tightly to my husband's hand. The past was firmly left behind. Now, stretching out in front of me is a radiant, beautiful future, a happiness I had to fight tooth and nail to achieve. And I know, without a shadow of a doubt, that I will cherish and protect it with every ounce of strength I possess. That random, fleeting encounter in the supermarket felt like my final, definitive farewell to the past. It didn't trigger a single negative emotion inside me, no anger, no contempt, no pain. Instead, I just felt incredibly light. I saw the physical toll his choices had taken on Michael, and the heavy price he continues to pay. He was no longer the cruel, patriarchal abuser from the past, but just an ordinary, broken man struggling to survive, carrying the crushing weight of his colossal mistakes on his shoulders. And I realized that I had finally found absolute peace within my own soul. I was no longer his victim. I was the victor. Not because I had orchestrated some grand, violent revenge to destroy them, but because I had survived their inferno and found my own radiant happiness. I refused to let that dark, traumatic chapter dictate the rest of my life. My wedding to my current husband was a modest, yet incredibly warm and intimate affair, attended only by our immediate families and closest friends. My parents, after finally learning the full, horrific truth about what I had endured, offered no objections to my second marriage. At first, they were naturally terrified that I might get hurt again, but after meeting my husband and witnessing the pure sincerity, maturity, and unwavering devotion he showed me, their fears completely vanished. They only ever wanted me to be happy, and I am, truly, deeply happy. My husband is a spectacular man. He loves me unconditionally. He takes incredible care of me. He always listens, validates my feelings, and strives to understand me. He has never, not even once, judged me for my past. Instead, he values my survival. He constantly tells me that those brutal experiences are exactly what forged the strong, resilient, and fiercely independent woman he fell in love with today. He helped me scrub away the lingering traumas of my past and made me believe in the beauty of love and marriage all over again. We recently welcomed a beautiful, bright-eyed baby girl into the world, whom we named Anna. She is the absolute joy of our entire family, the radiant center of our universe. Every single time I look at her sweet smile, I am reminded that this world is, in fact, incredibly beautiful. I have everything a woman could possibly dream of. A loving, devoted husband, a perfect daughter, a thriving career, and a peaceful, fulfilling life. I have learned to deeply cherish the simple things, the small, quiet moments of joy in everyday life. A warm, home-cooked family dinner, a breezy evening stroll through the park with my husband and daughter, the tight, sleepy embrace of my little girl right before bedtime. These are the most precious, invaluable gifts that life has given me. Sometimes, in the dead of night when the world is quiet and I look back on my journey, a small shiver of fear still runs down my spine. I had to wade through so much agony and shed an ocean of tears. There were definitely moments when I was so consumed by despair that I genuinely believed I would never escape that suburban hell. But I harbor no regrets, because those brutal trials forged me into a much more mature, formidable woman. They taught me the most vital lessons in life. Never let anyone, no matter who they are, trample on your dignity and self-worth. Always stand your ground, protect yourself fiercely, and fight relentlessly for the happiness you deserve. They also taught me that silence is not always golden. Sometimes, silence is simply complicity with evil. My story may have started as a tragedy, but it is ultimately a testament to hope. It proves that after the most violent hurricane, profound peace always follows. It does not matter how insurmountable the hardships or trials you face may seem. Never, ever lose hope. Believe with all your heart that at the very end of that dark, terrifying tunnel, happiness is waiting for you. If you possess the courage to walk through the darkness, you will eventually find the light of your life. And always remember that you are never truly alone. There are always people out there who will love you and stand ready to help you. And if you have ever experienced abuse, betrayal, and injustice the way I did, do not hesitate to speak your truth. Perhaps your story will become the ultimate source of motivation and inspiration for countless other women who desperately need to hear it. This story may be heartbreaking at its core, but it is a story of resurrection. It proves that after every storm, the sun will shine again. To all the women out there enduring abuse in silence, you are not alone, and you are not weak. Learn to set your boundaries, stand tall, and most importantly, love yourself.